Welcome to another video, and if you're out of the loop, the Misery Gauntlet has been ongoing, and I've been both playing and spectating, and it's been an absolute blast. This is easily the hardest race that Path of Exile has ever seen. Just look at these ridiculous modifiers. I have a massive amount of respect for all of the participants that are going deep in this gauntlet. It is way more difficult than it seems, and in this video we're going to be talking about one of those participants, that's Jungroan and his Trickster build. I wanted to highlight this build in particular because Jungroan's progression through the gauntlet was fascinating to me, from playing a very unique setup in the early stages while farming, to making the switch to a bossing setup which is so incredibly different to pretty much any of the bossing setups that were being discussed prior to the gauntlet start. So let's first talk a little bit about that setup that was used during the gearing stage. Jung was using the combo of Frostbolt and the new Ice Nova of Frostbolt's Transfigured Gem to farm up during the first 4 or 5 days of the gauntlet, opting to level up his main character while acquiring gear for the bossing build swap later on, as opposed to many other participants who decided to farm up on a much safer build like a Bone Shattered Juggernaut and then level another character for bossing in the late stages of the event. However, despite how well the Ice Nova of Frostbolt's build performed, it's unfortunately not really good enough for bossing because the build needs to spend too much time casting to have good damage uptime. You're likely to just die to many of the dangerous abilities while trying to get damage in, so Jung needed a more passive approach to damage, one that would allow him to play more freely with movement so that he could focus on avoiding those boss abilities. Enter Blade Trap of Laceration. Unfortunately for Jung, the Misery Gauntlet also has a rule which required the use of Transfigured Gems specifically for dealing damage during bossing. And since he was using the skill to inflict poison, he wasn't benefiting from the bleed specific stats on Blade Trap of Laceration either. And as such, normal Blade Trap would have been double damage for his build, because even though it has half the effective damage, it also rotates 4 times compared to the single rotation on the Transfigured version. But the rules are final, so Blade Trap of Laceration was Jungroan's bossing ability of choice. And what about that poison aspect? Jung was switching between the use of a tincture with the all damage can poison implicit and the inextricable fate unique boots, which allow all damage to inflict poison once the enemy has been stationary for a brief period of time. For the tincture setup, it requires poison chance as well, so Jung was switching some support gems and masteries around to allow for this requirement. Let's head over to the path of building for the bossing variant of this build using Inextricable Fate. So Jung has opted for the Trickster Ascendancy, with both Escape Artist and Spellbreaker being massive parts of the defensive makeup of the build. Escape Artist provides bonus evasion and maximum energy shield based on the stats on the equipped helmet and body armor, and the gear used in this build is absolutely insane, especially considering that this is not only solo self-found, but it's also under the pressure of those incredibly difficult gauntlet mods, and it's hardcore, and within the time frame of only 4 or 5 days spent gearing up this character. Just look at this triple tier 1 prefix Sadist garb, providing an incredible amount of evasion and energy shield. Combine that with the large amount of energy shield granted by the Hubris Circlet helmet, and the Trickster's Escape Artist notable is granting a ridiculous 1625 evasion rating and 381 maximum energy shield. However, the synergy doesn't end there, because those numbers and the ones on the Sadist garb itself are actually being doubled because Jung is making use of the Oath of the Magi notable on the Wildwood's Warden of the Magi Ascendancy, which doubles the defenses granted by the equipped body armor as long as there is no socketed gems. And since his main damage link is in his gloves, he's gaining a huge amount of bonus evasion and energy shield from this notable synergy with the Trickster. There's also this crazy titanium shield that I should mention, which also just has triple tier 1 prefix for a massive 429 energy shield. The large amount of energy shield is then boosted up through increases to maximum energy shield and the sizable amount of intelligence, to provide a respectable near 13,000 energy shield, which Jung is combining with Chaos Inoculation to make him immune to Chaos damage, whilst using energy shield as his primary life pool. So next up, the defensive layering, which turns that huge chunk of energy shield into a build that can absorb giant boss abilities, beginning with Spell Suppression, which is gained from the Inveterate wheel and the Instinct wheel on the passive skill tree, combined with the Trickster's Spellbreaker and crafted suppression on both the shield and body armor. This brings the total to 100% chance to suppress spell damage. Now, base spell suppression lessens the damage taken from incoming spell hits by 50%, but Spellbreaker provides an additional 10% suppressed damage while on full energy shield. Add to that the 3% from Inveterate and another 3% from the Suppression Mastery, and that brings the total suppressed spell damage to 66% as long as energy shield is full when the spell hits. Jungroan is also using another Suppression Mastery here, which makes it so that spell hits cannot inflict elemental ailments on him, which is quite powerful, especially with the existence of the Atziri apparitions in the Uber boss arenas in the Misery Gauntlet. One of the big damage avoidance layers in this build is the near 50,000 evasion, which is largely gained from the combination of Escape Artist and the Oath of the Magi that we discussed earlier, combined with the evasion and energy shield mastery taken here, which grants 1% increased evasion rating per 5 intelligence. This evasion is then put to use with Ghost Dance, a keystone which grants stacks of Ghost Shroud which are consumed to recover energy shield when hit, and with about 50,000 evasion, this will recover around 1,500 energy shield every time it procs. Speaking of recovery, this build's primary source of recovery is energy shield recharge. The Trickster's Spellbreaker Notable provides 50% chance to begin energy shield recharge after suppressing a spell hit, whilst Wicked Ward will stop the recharge from being interrupted by incoming damage as long as recharge started in the past 4 seconds. Jung is also using Vow Discipline, so he can extend that duration in which damage won't interrupt recharge if timed correctly. In the cases where recharge is required where either Spellbreaker doesn't proc or the damage came from degen or an attack, the delay for recharge to start normally is just 1.1 seconds thanks to the faster start of energy shield recharge from the modifiers on the body armor and shield. And this means that the build has a fairly reliable 4,500 energy shield recovered per second. Now, you may notice that the build is only using 3 flasks, and that's because it's making use of a timeless keystone, the Traitor, which is granted from the Brutal Restraint Jewel when it's in the name of Balbala. The Traitor grants flask charges based on empty flask slots, and when combined with the Eldritch Implicit from the body armor, which also grants flask charges, and the Careful Conservationist wheel taken on the passive skill tree down here, Jung has permanent uptime on these flasks during bossing. The Ruby and Topaz flask both have 30% increased effect, for a total of 26% less fire and lightning damage taken respectively, while the Taste of Hate has 5% increased effect for 21% less cold damage taken. These flasks also provide the necessary resistance so the build is capped out on elemental resistances. The Taste of Hate unique flask is also providing another important modifier, so let's discuss how this build deals with physical damage. 15% of physical damage from hits is taken as cold damage due to the Taste of Hate flask being active all the time. Then a further 8% of physical damage from hits is taken as fire damage due to the crafted Corel modifier on the helmet. So 23% of physical damage from hits is being mitigated by elemental resistances. Jung then has an Eldritch Implicit also on the helmet, which makes 7% of physical damage from hits be taken as chaos damage, and the armor and energy shield mastery that provides a further 10% of this stat, for a total of 17% of physical damage from hits taken as chaos damage, and due to Chaos Inoculation, that portion of incoming physical damage is removed from the calculation for an effective 17% less damage taken from physical hits. There's also a minimum endurance charge crafted on the amulet for 4% additional physical damage reduction, and the rest of any incoming physical damage is being absorbed by that massive energy shield pool. So whilst physical damage is a weakness, it's less of an issue when you know what you need to avoid in a bossing scenario. Now, one of the most important defenses that this build has that we haven't discussed just yet is the amount of action and movement speed slows that it can apply to bosses. Summon Skitterboss applies Chill for 11% reduced action speed, and Temporal Chains lessens action speed by 18% against bosses. Jung is also using the Curse Mastery for Hinder, which reduces movement speed on enemies you curse by 15%. This combination provides a much larger window to react to dangerous boss abilities. And if you watch Jungroan's bossing, especially when compared to another player that doesn't have access to these slows, the difference is night and day. There's also the Trickster's One Step Ahead notable, which guarantees an action speed slow on nearby monsters, useful on adds and upon entering or re-entering arenas before Temp Chains has been applied. The Leaf Shake keystone is also being used to help out against damage over time, which is usually a very impactful keystone in boss arenas with those ground degens. However, with the inclusion of the Azeri apparition in the Gauntlet, the bleed inflicted by her spears was lasting an incredibly long amount of time due to the more ailment duration downside on this keystone, effectively disabling the upside for a large duration, as Jung had no way to remove the bleed. There's also a self-cast Immortal Call, which is very helpful, especially with the Azeri apparition creating some sticky situations with overlapping mechanics. Lastly, for the defensive side of this build, Corrupted Blood immunity is being obtained from a rare dual Corrupted Implicit here, and was being used whenever necessary. I'll briefly touch on the offensive side of this build. As I did mention the usage of Inextricable Fate earlier in the video, Jung landed on Blade Trap as his ability of choice, and he was forced to use Blade Trap of Laceration for bossing. He dropped the Sunblast unique belt, which makes trap skills throw an extra 2 traps each throw, at the cost of an extra delay on traps triggering. Then the Ephemeral Edge unique sword is being used, which we've seen a lot of this league, due to the large amount of energy shield pool that can be obtained on a Trickster. This unique sword grants added maximum lightning attack damage equal to 20% of maximum energy shield, whilst also providing a huge increase to energy shield. And as long as the enemy has been stationary for a brief period of time, all of that damage will inflict poison due to Inextricable Fate's modifier. Now, Jung's Trickster unfortunately did die during the Uber Maven encounter, and I have to say that this was pretty unlucky timing. As you can see, Maven uses her Take This ability for the fireball projectiles, and he moves close to Maven in an attempt to avoid the balls, as there is a small safe space that you can stand right on top of the boss where you won't get hit. But with the Gauntlet Haste modifier, he just mistimes this slightly, and amazingly, his build is actually able to tank the Maven Fireball. He survives with a small amount of energy shield left, but the Azeri apparition was actually using Flame Blast at the same time as the Maven Fireball, and you can barely see the Flame Blast animation starting because it begins right under the animation of the Fireball. So this Flame Blast also hits him, and his character unfortunately falls. Regardless, an absolutely incredible run from Jungroan. He was able to clear all of the normal point bosses with the exception of Uber Elder, and all of the point invites as well, except for the Feared. He also cleared Uber Eater and Uber Shaper, so a crazy deep run in the most difficult Path of Exile event we've ever seen. And there you have it, Jungroan's Misery Gauntlet Trickster build, a fun build to watch the progression on and the bossing, and a fun one to cover too. I will be covering more of the Gauntlet builds with more videos in this series in the time between now and the next league, so if you've enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, make sure you subscribe so you can come back and check out those when they go live. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you as always for your continued support, it is very much appreciated. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.